tonight, well, we talked about poverty, or we talked about prayer, fasting, almsgiving. And basically, the whole idea is that as Orthodox Christians, we should strive to live a virtuous life, seeking to attain to the virtues. You can look at the list of virtues given by St. Paul: Galatians, love, joy, peace, humility, long-suffering, self-control. And really there's a kind of a summary of virtuous life given in what's kind of the traditional monastic rule. And it's not just for monastics, it's for all Orthodox Christians, but interpreted differently. Poverty, chastity, obedience. Now, what do those mean? It means one thing in a monastery. Poverty obviously means not only non-acquisitiveness, but it also in a monastery means not having any personal possessions. Some monasteries are stricter than others, where you can have some books, your own books and icons and a few things. Some other monasteries are extremely strict, where you basically own nothing at all. There's the Benedictine way of doing monastic poverty, and they tend to try and eliminate the word "my" and "mine." So it's our clothing, but quite frankly, it's my toothbrush. My shorts, not anybody else's. But actually in monasteries, one of the things that they'll do in some of these monasteries is that the laundry all goes into common loads, and it gets all mixed up, and you can't, there's not anybody's. Yeah. So that's a little much.
Yeah.
It's a little much.
That's in the Catholic monasteries, right?
But some, they don't really, that I know of, they don't really have, most Orthodox monasteries have laundry as an obedience. It's usually people do their own. So, poverty also means non-acquisitiveness, but especially in a non-monastic context, where people are not totally renouncing possessions, which is the idea in the monastery. It means detachment from money, from possessions, from things, so that you're not held down by the things of this world. Your whole life is not about pursuing the almighty dollar. It's not about trying to get more and more stuff. It's not about trying to accumulate wealth. It's not about trying to, but rather it's a sense of stewardship of what one is given and what one, I won't say possesses, although in a worldly sense it's possessing, but it's a stewardship of that, knowing that all things belong to God. Chastity. Within marriage, between a man and a woman, sexuality, sexual expression is blessed. Outside of the context of the marriage of a man and a woman, sexual expression is not blessed. And that's very important. In a monastery, of course, there's no sexual expression is renounced. That doesn't mean there's no affection, that doesn't mean there's no personal intimacy, but rather than being an exclusive relationship, which is what the relationship between a husband and a wife is, it's an inclusive, there's inclusive relationships. And one of the things that is that has to be excluded in a monastery are exclusive relationships, particular friendships that can get quite out of control, into all sorts of dangerous realms, which may be politically correct in the world, especially now, but so far as Christianity goes, are never acceptable. On the other hand, there's a context for friendship, as long as it remains a kind of an open friendship that's inclusive of other people, where you really see some of the most profound expressions of what authentic friendship is between people of the same sex. There's a great Western father, Elred of Rivaux, who wrote a beautiful treatise on friendship. And that was mainly actually the context of a master and disciple. And you find that actually throughout the literature. So within the context of marriage, sexuality is blessed, but not for the sake of hedonism, but rather sexuality is a normal part of the expression of the love and the communion between a husband and a wife, and it's meant always to be open to the begetting of children. One of the biggest problems, I think, that has arisen since the sexual revolution of the 60s is the divorce, as it were, between sexuality and childbearing. The main point of sexuality is not personal pleasure. The main point is having children, is begetting children. And it really helps to keep things in context when you keep that in mind. You're going to have sex with somebody, you're going to have a child together. It's not about personal gratification. And I think within the church, we of course maintain that. Now, one of the biggest things that's contributed to that has been abortion. Abortion is immoral and amoral and evil, and is unequivocally condemned by the church. Unequivocally. But it's basically through because of abortion and the developments within birth control, which is also a very interesting and important topic. That the churches, well, it's because of abortion and birth control, the society is able to maintain, to a great extent, the separation between sex and childbearing. However, that's certainly not universal. And there are plenty of people who use birth control who end up being parents. And I'll get back to these topics. Obedience. In a monastery, obedience is actually a sacramental relationship. It's a sacramental relationship between an elder and a disciple, primarily, of discipleship and of that is meant to lead the disciple into greater and greater synergy or communion with the will of God. The disciple learns how to cut off his will and is able to to live essentially carefree, because he doesn't have to make any decisions. Now there's a negative side of that, because what it can lead to when it's applied wrong is kind of perpetual immaturity, and this is a very grave danger of it. People who are unable to take responsibility for themselves or their own actions, and that's an abuse. But one of the things that's essentially fallen out of practice within the Orthodox world in monasticism is unquestioning obedience. Partly because there have been so many abuses, but also because there are so few elders, if any, that are able to maintain that kind of a relationship. Because it's a very intense personal relationship. You know, it means constant, almost unbroken contact. And confession once a day is not enough in such a relationship. So St. Ignatius Chaninov, in his book The Arena, talks about living a relationship of obedience as rather than unquestioning obedience, it's living life under spiritual advice. Unquestioning obedience means that the elder takes total responsibility for the actions of the disciple. There's all sorts of problems that have arisen from that. But life under spiritual advice means that the disciple retains responsibility for his own actions, whether he does it or whether he doesn't. Now, when I was just at the very beginning of thinking about monastic life, when I was in Russia, I went to the monastery of St. Tikhon in Zadansk. It was '93 and things were in transition, shall we say. The monastery had received back this part of this complex of buildings, which was had been turned, this huge ruin of a monastery, part of which had been turned into a psychiatric hospital. Several buildings remained part of a psychiatric hospital, and so they got back some of the buildings, which were in horrible shape and was a mess. There were monks living on the top floor of one building and nuns living on the lower floor. And the courtyard of the monastery was a mess. It was being excavated for who knows what. But you look down and you see all these bones, human skulls and bones. Because the courtyards of monasteries are cemeteries. And the elder, whose name I don't quite remember, I think he later became a bishop, had a very, what I thought at that time, being a rather zealous pseudo-novice, a pre-novice, a very laissez-faire attitude. Said, well, if they do it, if they do their obedience, it's a blessing. If they don't do their obedience, they miss the blessing. I thought, well, okay, interesting. But somehow it worked. There's another story about that place, which the liturgy on Sunday was quite interesting, because they got all the way up to priest communion, had priest communion as usual, and then you expected them to bring out the chalice. Wrong. They sent out a young priest monk to hear confessions. The archimandrite went over and hung out with the choir director. And the married priest, who was assigned to the monastery, took off his vestments and went home. And it was 2.5 hours before the confessions were finished, because this poor young priest monk had 400 confessions to hear. So I'm afraid that was one of the instances in Russia that I emerged from that monastery saying, Schmemann was right. Schmemann was right. Anyway, one of the biggest issues that's faced Orthodoxy in America is the application of obedience within a parochial context. And there are some, in Russia they had a problem with what they called mladostartsi, young elders. Of course it's an oxymoron, young elders. Well, you know, there were these hotshot young kids who somehow got ordained. Some of them just had 2 hairs sticking out of their chins, you know, and they were essentially acting like elders, and not only hearing confessions, but trying to control people's lives. Well, in America, we had you know, Pastor Billy Bob, who became Archpriest Barsanufius overnight, and who decided that since he was a presbyter, he was an elder. Of course, the word in Greek, presbyter, means elder. And so he was going to demand strict obedience, monastic style, out of his parishioners. And there's all sorts of stories that one can tell. But what inevitably results is a personality cult. And it's a disaster. The monastery is structured by sacramental obedience. It's a sacramental community that is structured by this relationship of obedience. Now, for lay people, the sacramental community that's structured by obedience is marriage. It's marriage. A parish is not a sacramental community. The family is the sacramental community. The relationship of obedience within a family, of husband and wife, and of children to parents, is precisely analogous to that of the abbot and his monks in a monastery, or the abbess and her nuns in a women's monastery. But when you have these guys who think that they're elders, and they start interfering in the lives of families, everything goes awry, and it creates a personality cult, and it's very sad. It's very sad. I have a friend in California who took over a church that had been, I think, Foursquare, some kind of evangelical church that had converted, and the pastor had converted, and Archpriest Billy Bob, or Pastor Billy Bob, became Archpriest Barsanufius or something, and with his wife and children, and you know, and so they had. He decided, you know, he was going to be the elder of that community, and he wouldn't let anybody in, any outside influence in. They wouldn't go visit other churches. They wouldn't see what other Orthodox did. They did it all by the book. So, think about when you're an evangelical Protestant trying to put together an Orthodox church, just the church, by the book. So, they had an idea that an analogion, you know, an icon stand, and an icon and a candle should be somehow in relationship to one another, right? You go into a typical Russian church and you see the analogion with the icon and the candles. Where do you think they put the candle?
On the icon?
On the shelf below the icon.
Oh gosh.
And then they covered it, and then they covered it. So there was this, highest glow in I guess, It's amazing they didn't burn it down.
Yes.
That was that was one of the funnier things. It was one of the few funny things about this community. Some of the less funny things were that the parish had never incorporated. So, where did all the people's tithes, and they were strict about tithing, like income tax form examination, strict. They went into the pastor's personal account.
Oh my gosh.
So, and these are Orange County and yuppies, right? So they're pulling, these families were pulling in $8,000 and $10,000 a month, and so the pastor was doing pretty well, pretty well.
Were they part of a canonical church?
Yep. They didn't let the bishop in for 10 years. until the congregation realized this priest has to go, and we know there are problems, but we haven't any idea what they are. Then another thing that was kind of interesting was after the priest got to know the families in the parish, without changing anything, I think he moved the candles, without changing, like the arrangement of the icons or church furniture, except where absolutely necessary. Because the basic principle is that when you go into a new church, you don't change things right away, unless it's really, impossible. So he began to notice that this whole main group of icons were the family icons of the pastor and his family. And that each family had their family icons hanging in the church. But then he began to wonder, because coffee hour was a little rough. And given the intensity of services that was required, and the pastor required that the people be at the services, or else they would not be welcome in the church. Matins at 6 a.m. every morning, and vespers at 5:30 or 6 every night. He thought, well, they should be able to arrange a coffee. What about the sisterhood? And so he asked, well, what about the sisterhood? Can't they put... And they said, sisterhood? Well, our pastor, he always taught us that women were evil, and that to put a whole group of women together in a parish was bringing Satan right into the heart of the church. If you can imagine. And what people will fall for.
It's terrible.
Yeah, it is terrible. So that poor priest has had a whole lot of work to do.
Yes.
Basically educating people in what Orthodoxy is and what Christianity is. Not to mention that he would control people's lives. They couldn't make a decision. What color paint to buy for the living room? What kind of carpeting to buy? What kind and style of furniture should they buy? Whether they should have children or not, or another child. Whether all of these decisions. I suppose if you wanted to ask a friend, or a pastor as a friend, you know, if you had a recommendation on a kind of paint or some, you know, I mean, you can do that if you have that kind of relationship. But what's really important to understand is that the relationship of obedience in a parish basically is limited to the confessional and is limited to spiritual advice regarding the spiritual life and nothing else. And nothing else. It's not about, if you have a spiritual father relationship with a priest, and you can develop the relationship a bit, but that's really beyond the it's really beyond the ministry of the parish priest. You know, the parish priest is there to hold together pastorally the community of families, which is the parish, and to keep them in the Orthodox faith. You know, hear their confessions and to encourage them in the spiritual life and to teach them the faith and things like that. Maybe common projects like building a new church or, you know, a hall or whatever it is. Common projects that will benefit the whole community. But it's never, ever, ever to control people's lives. For a while, this was a big problem in America, especially with the large influx of evangelicals into the Antiochians and the OCA. This is not unknown in Roe Court either, because it's the same context. You got new converts who are installed as pastors and ordained as priests, installed as pastors, and they think all of a sudden that they're something that they're not. And that's called delusion.
It's called what?
Delusion.
Delusion.
Or Russian word is prelest. Plane in Greek. And there's all sorts of kinds of prelest. But this is one particularly that has afflicted the church in certain ways, in certain contexts. However, the obedience that we have is in the world as lay people is still important. It's important to listen to your parish priest when he asks you to do something in confession, and if he gives you a penance or gives you some spiritual advice. It's not make or break kind of thing, and you shouldn't go from priest to priest comparing whether you like their answer or not. You know, especially playing one off another. That's never good. One should always have one father confessor and take his advice. Otherwise, it leads to confusion. But the goal is the same. The goal is the same, to help us cut off our will, cut off our selfishness, and to live our life in service of others, so that we're not totally focused on serving ourselves and our passions and thoughts and desires. Poverty, chastity, obedience. In reality, it's all about detachment and renunciation. Poverty, detachment from stuff, money and stuff. Chastity, detachment from the body. Chastity doesn't only mean, it isn't only in relation to sex. Chastity is actually, if you look at say the Russian root, which means wholeness of wisdom, tselomudria. The Greek is sophrosine, which also has this sense of wisdom in it. And in a sense, you could express chastity the meaning of chastity as integrity. How do we maintain the integrity of our lives? And in doing and in thinking about that, of course, our relational integrity is very important. You know, we're not going off and committing fornication and adultery with anyone and everyone, you know, but rather remain focused on the one person that's given to us, whether that is our spouse or whether that is the Lord Jesus Christ. One of the things the Orthodox world has never gotten into is the kind of nuptial mysticism that the West has. I think it seems very odd to an Orthodox mind. So, are there any questions?
When you say nuptial mysticism, what exactly is
Yeah, what is
that?
There's a whole school of spirituality in the West about, especially for women, of thinking themselves in mystical marriage with Christ, and the way things evolve. They go to their tantra in a wedding dress,
Oh, yes.
and the whole.
Okay.
Okay. You know, in the Orthodox Church, you go to your tantra in a hair shirt, basically, male or female doesn't matter. And then this whole kind of, I think it got really kind of over eroticized at certain points. It's, you know, a later medieval kind of thing. When the Western Church kind of lost its foundations, and when Western religious life kind of lost its foundations. So, what else?
What happened to Archpriest Barsanuphius after he had been removed from his parish?
He was retired,
But he remained Orthodox, right?
as far as I know.
That's good.
Yeah. One of the things that's very interesting, I don't know, have you all heard of the Benedict option that's being talked about on the... well, there's an old friend of mine by the name of Rod Dreher, who writes for the American Conservative magazine. He's Orthodox. He wrote a book, Crunchy Conservatism, which was really funny. It had a picture of a VW hippie bus, I think with a Republican logo or something. Anyway, he's an old friend. And one of the, and he's a very, very popular columnist and writer. He was in Dallas when I got to know him. He eventually moved to Louisiana, back to his hometown when his sister was dying of cancer. And his latest book actually was about her and her death. But one of the things that Rod in particular, and this is kind of getting around in multiple circles, is talking about the Benedict option. As the society grows more and more hostile to traditional Christianity, to look and see what happened in the Middle Ages, or in the late Roman Empire when that happened, is that people withdrew to the countryside, into and around monasteries, and living kind of holistic lives in that context, in a semi-monastic context, or as monastics, basically to avoid the secular chaos. Because the Roman Empire also went through the same kind of stuff that, it was a time of rampant immorality and rebellion against the church, rebellion against the gospel, Remember when Christianity was made the official religion of the empire, 10% of the empire was Christian. So you had the other 90% that were doing all sorts of things, and all sorts of immorality reigned, until it all came crashing down in the West. That actually started just after the First Ecumenical Council. And St. Augustine died as the Vandals were sacking his city. I think the first raids successful raids on the city of Rome were, what, 330 something. And then it finally fell around 450. 476. 476. So. But one of the things that, on the other side of the coin, with some of these intentional communities, which is what that one convert community that I described to you was. It was an intentional community. It wasn't just a parish. It was an intentional community. And there are several of those intentional communities that still remain. There's one in Ben Lomond, California. There's one in Isla Vista, California. And then there's another one in near Anchorage in Eagle River, Alaska. That were put together by this group of Campus Crusade for Christ ministers who found Orthodoxy. And so the joke comes: what do you call a Protestant who starts reading the Fathers? A catechumen. So, whereas abuses happened, on the other hand, one of the things that was really remarkable was the creation of these intentional communities where people moved together around a church. They intentionally moved into and took over neighborhoods. Now, I'm most familiar with the Ben Lomond community, since I lived just over the hill in Saratoga for several years. And one of my closest friends was one of the priests in that community. At its height, if you could cram them all into the church, there were about 800 people on a Sunday morning singing the liturgy. All together, of course. It was absolutely mind-blowing. And it's no wonder that the devil didn't like it and played havoc with it. The liturgy would be celebrated by a dozen priests and 20 deacons, and it was huge. Huge liturgical celebration, which actually the Orthodox are the best at, of anybody. With magnificent music, a lot of it locally composed. Once they got over the organ and the band and the praise band, they really excelled. And it took somewhat of a strong hand to keep that all together. Because 800 individuals, that's what, about 300 or 400 families. And so, still, it's, there's still a large remnant of that left. Now, 30 years later, 37 years later. So, but one of the things that we haven't really thought about, I think, or we haven't really talked about very much within the Orthodox world, is the possibility of doing intentional Christian communities. It's certainly a tradition of the Church. People move. One of the most ancient forms of Orthodox Christian missionization was that monks would go out into the wilderness, they'd form a monastery, people would start coming around because they liked it, wanted to be part of it, and so a village would grow up around the church, and then the monks would get sick of all the people, and some of them would move on, but the monastery was there, and would minister to the people, and there would be this kind of organic community that would grow, and people would support one another. There would be ministries within the community. Just within the, say within the Ben Lomond community, there was a very substantial church school. There was community outreach. There was a pregnancy center. There was, all these various kinds of ministries that were based out of this community. And so it became and for the most part, these were Silicon Valley yuppies, who elected to commute an extra half hour to their jobs in the Silicon Valley in order for their families to live within this very integrated, holistic community. So it can be done. It didn't form around a monastery, but a monastery developed in the midst of it. And they became great patrons of monasteries throughout California. You see the same thing again in Eagle River, Alaska, and something similar down near Santa Barbara. So.
Now something like that is happening also around St. Anthony's Monastery in Arizona.
Yeah. Well, most monasteries have people who live nearby and who are part of the broader community. And when a monastery matures, people have the confidence that it's going to be there, so they can move in and kind of base their lives around that community. So what do you all think of such an idea?
I think it's a thing for future. Maybe with what all is happening in this country, that may be a natural condition to develop these.
I wonder what type of pastoral, what you'd have to have for maybe some kind of accountability within multiple priests to hold it together, because I understand all too well that heavy hand that you have to keep it all together, and I don't know how you would. I mean, I could understand it based around the monastery, but I don't see. I mean, every time I've seen that heavy hand that's kept it all together, it's all come down eventually.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how you answer that. Once you have a core group of clergy that are accountable to each other, or what happens there? But
I think you need a good spiritual leader.
Yes. Yes.
But is that these days? I don't know.
Well, I mean, there are people who are mature in the spiritual life, and it's. But the main thing is somebody who's been, and this brings up the whole question of what is authentic eldership.
Yeah.
To be an elder, a starets, is an obedience. But it's an obedience that can only be given to people who have achieved a certain amount of purification and spiritual gifts. In the Greek Church, partly because during the Turkish yoke, they would simply ordain, shall we say, probably the most literate person in the village, which might not have been very literate, but who also knew and loved the services. And so he could do the services, but he was forbidden to hear confessions. And even today there's a special blessing for a priest in the Greek tradition to actually hear confessions and be a spiritual father. In the Russian church, because of the situation of the church just being restored after being obliterated, and all the institutions new, and almost the entire population, or at least the entire Christian population, being new converts to the faith, because the number of faithful who remained really faithful during the Soviet period was actually very low. And so when people converted, I mean, they converted in mass, and especially in the 90s, there was this huge move of young people into the church in the 80s and the 90s, and it was, part of it was, I think, an expression of rebellion against the Soviet state, and part of it was an authentic seeking. Well, a lot of these guys ended up being tonsured as monks and ordained, and with no formation by anybody, and that created a lot of problems. However, one of the things that also did emerge from the Soviet yoke were a number of great elders, men, mostly men, but also nuns, who had been purified by their experience in the Gulag, by their experience of persecution, and who had already achieved profound spiritual maturity. Personally, I had the blessing to know several of these people. Now, not all of the elders who had great spiritual gifts were given the blessing and the obedience to be startsi, especially for the people. They might have some monastic disciples, but for the people, they were not blessed by the monastic authorities to do that, because those gifts were not discerned of being able to deal with the people. And so it's quite a difference between, say, Elder Naum at the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, where on any given day during the week, the babushki would start lining up at 6 o'clock in the morning, as soon as they opened the gates of the monastery, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of mostly babushki in line to see the elder. And they literally filled half of a floor of a building. You know, just lines and lines and lines of people. Whereas others of the elders didn't receive people at all, but they did receive monastics. There was another elder at the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, one of the great fathers of the new Russian Church since the Restoration, was Elder Kirill. He had 100 men's monasteries under his direction, and the monks within them. I think he very seldom saw lay people, but it was his ministry of spiritual direction was primarily to the monks, and to the seminarians there at the Lavra as well. So, to be an elder is an obedience within a monastic context. It's not really. It's very seldom found in the world. Now, there was one elderess that I met who lived outside of St. Petersburg in a village called Suzanina, and her name was Lubishka. And she was this little tiny, bent over babushka who would do weird things. She was kind of a fool for Christ. She writing on her hand and mumbling, but if you were around her for a while, you began to realize that she was one of the pillars whose prayer held up the world. Of which there are seldom more than 4 or 5 in the entire world. There was another great elder, Father Nikolai on the lake outside of Pskov. I don't remember. And he was a priest in a village. I think he probably would have been in a monastery had the times been different. But he dealt with lay people. But the ministry is very particularly monastic. St. John of Kronstadt obviously was also a great elder, but his situation being a pastor in the world was very unusual for somebody with those kind of spiritual gifts. But one of the general rules is for when in encountering the elders, one of the ways that you know a true elder is that they leave you in the most radical and absolute freedom. You know, they've let you know or helped you to understand exactly what you need to do, but it's entirely up to your choice as to whether you do it or not. And it's that's the spiritual, and within that is the core of a great spiritual struggle. To be obedient to that, to live in that kind of obedience to the elder's command. Somebody who you might go to once in your life, who you've never met before, who you'll never meet again, but who knows you, who recognizes you, can tell you your name and can tell you all of your sins, including the ones you don't even want to admit to yourself. And when you encounter people like this, there's this overwhelming trust, because you perceive the grace of God within them, and it's amazing. It's amazing. Now this kind of spiritual leadership has for centuries has been at the core of monastic life. Usually the elders would go off and become hermits, not out of disdain for people, but out of love for people, and to be able to minister to them better and to pray without distraction better for those who came to them. So we have people like the newly canonized St. Paisi of Mount Athos, other fathers who have withdrawn into seclusion. But it's almost always a relative seclusion. It may be for a short time or a longer time, but it's something that's very fruitful. There's an old monastic saying that the hermits are the lights for the monks. Now the angels are the lights for the hermits. The hermits are the lights for the monks, and the monks are the lights for the lay people. To guide and to inspire. So, any questions? Okay. No. One of the next thing on the syllabus is family prayer and personal prayer. We'll go into that in the next because that goes together with the home as a little church or monastery. I have down here hospitality. Hospitality is a very important virtue within Orthodoxy. Receiving people, opening yourself to people, opening your home, opening your life. As the old saying goes, you may be receiving angels unaware. And it's interesting that the icon that we use as one of the most profound images of the Holy Trinity is actually the icon of the hospitality of Abraham. Our society has totally de-emphasized hospitality, and how much, and we don't even know our neighbors, and how less likely are we even to receive a stranger into our house. So I think this is something that we need to consider. Incidentally, those intentional communities that I mentioned have organized had organized hospitality committees. So they would have a guest house. You might be received with, and I'm talking. When I went to visit them first, I was a layman. I hadn't gone to Russia yet. Wasn't a monk. I was a choir director in the church, in the nearby church, and I was received like a bishop. You know, they had a big basket full of fruit and stuff for me, you know, and it was amazing. And that's how they treated all of their guests. They had another ministry too, which was quite interesting. Was a shared housing arrangement for young people. From mainly college age kids, one floor for men, one floor for women, and a family in the middle that none might pass at inappropriate times. There's also another it was a context for teaching and for discipleship. It's a discipleship house. All sorts of things are made possible when you get a whole community of people that's living together intentionally as a community. Here, I mean, it would be wonderful, if a whole bunch of people moved around St. John's, but who can afford it? Houses are going for $800,000 in this neighborhood.
Why do you think that community, you said it at one point it was 800 people and now it's smaller?
Yeah.
What happened that it shrank? I mean, one would hope that it would grow and spread.
Well, there was a split. A whole lot of church politics.
Yeah.
And we're very unfortunate. But instead of one church in that valley, there are two. It's in a place called the San Lorenzo Valley. And there's the town of Ben Lomond and the town of Felton. They're about 4 miles apart in the Redwood Forest along a river. And a gorgeous area. And there are so many Orthodox there that the supermarket has to change its stock during Lent. The schools had to adapt to the Orthodox calendar.
Wow.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Now, who would think in Santa Cruz County, California, in the town of Santa Cruz, where the Green Party is on the right, and the city council is socialist, or was. So I think one of the ways to kind of summarize this is we talked about poverty, chastity, obedience, you know, both in their monastic and in their lay applications. But what it is, it's all about life in community. And what are the different types of community? First and foremost, it's community of the family. The parish is a community of families. There are also monastic communities. But then they've also developed in various places and various times intentional communities of families where it's more than a parish and not quite a monastery, but a place where people who are living in the world and holding down jobs can live as a Christian community together, supporting each other, working together on common projects and on common ministries. Something I would like very much to see developed within the life of the church. So
It's not too far off of where we're at in Florida.
Absolutely.
We're getting there slowly.
yeah, more affordable down there.
No,
No,
not on the beach.
well, no, not on the beach.